1965. In Washington, D.C., President Lyndon B. Johnson, backed by the full industrial and military might of the United States, authorized a massive escalation of American ground troops into South Vietnam. For the monolithic superpower, locked in the global chess match of the Cold War, Vietnam was a line in the sand, a domino that could not be allowed to fall to communism. The objective, as defined by the architects of the war, was clear and confident: to bring overwhelming force to bear upon a technologically inferior peasant army and to achieve victory through a strategy of attrition. The war, they believed, would be won by firepower. The American G.I. who stepped off the transport plane and onto the tarmac at Da Nang or Bien Hoa was the physical embodiment of this belief. He was arguably the best-equipped soldier in history. He carried the new M16 rifle, a futuristic weapon capable of firing over 700 rounds per minute. He wore a steel helmet and a flak jacket designed to stop shrapnel. Above his head, he had the guarantee of near-instant air support from Huey gunships, Phantom jets, and the earth-shattering thunder of B-52 bombers. He was the tip of a spear forged in the furnaces of Detroit and guided by the computers of the Pentagon. His mission was aggressive, proactive, search and destroy. He was not there to defend territory. He was there to hunt. His enemy, on paper, was a ghost from the past. The Viet Cong guerrilla, or VC, often wore simple black pajamas and sandals made from old tires. His primary weapon was frequently a bolt-action Mosin Nagant rifle from World War II, or the rugged but less sophisticated AK-47. He had no air force, no significant artillery, and no vast logistical tail. To the American military command, the outcome of a direct confrontation seemed a foregone conclusion. It was a battle between the future and the past, between steel and bamboo, and steel, they were certain, would always win. This fundamental miscalculation, this failure to understand the true nature of their adversary, would be the foundation upon which a decade of horror would be built. Because the Viet Cong were not fighting the same war. They were not interested in a battle of firepower. They were waging a war against the American mind, and their greatest ally was the ground itself. Before the American soldier ever saw a single enemy fighter, he met the true antagonist of his war. The jungle. The boonies, as they called it. It was not a place. It was a living, breathing entity, a verdant hell that seemed actively hostile to his existence. The heat was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of humidity that clung to the skin and never let go, capable of causing heat stroke in a matter of hours. The air was thick with the drone of insects, a constant symphony of creatures that bit, stung, and burrowed. Leeches dropped from the trees, finding their way into boots and clothing, silently draining a man's blood. The ground itself was a treacherous mire of mud, tangled roots, and razor-sharp elephant grass that could slice through a uniform and the skin beneath. This environment was a great equalizer. It stripped away America's technological advantages one by one. The dense, triple-canopy jungle reduced visibility to a few meters, rendering long-range rifles and air support often useless. The constant moisture caused weapons to jam and equipment to rot. The disorienting, featureless landscape made navigation a nightmare, turning a simple patrol into a terrifying ordeal of being lost. For the American GI, the jungle was not cover. It was a cage. It drained his physical strength, frayed his nerves, and isolated him from the world he knew. He was no longer the confident hunter. He was becoming the prey. And in this environment, the Viet Cong were not merely surviving. They were masters. For them, the jungle was not a prison. It was a sanctuary. It was their fortress, their supply depot, and their greatest weapon. They were the ghosts in this machine of green. Their doctrine of warfare, heavily influenced by the writings of Mao Zedong and their own General Von Nguyen Giap, was one of patience, elusiveness, and absolute ruthlessness. The guiding principle was simple and profound. The enemy advances, we retreat. The enemy camps, we harass. The enemy tires, we attack. The enemy retreats, we pursue. A direct stand-up fight against an American platoon was tactical suicide, but a war of 1,000 small cuts, a war against morale, was a war they could win. This led to the perfection of their most infamous and psychologically devastating tactic, the booby trap. For the Viet Cong, booby traps were not a secondary weapon. They were a cornerstone of their entire military strategy. They were cheap, endlessly sustainable, and achieved multiple objectives at once. First, they were an act of ultimate resourcefulness. In a country with little industrial base, the VC built their arsenal from the world around them. Bamboo, vines, rocks, and venomous snakes became instruments of war. Even more ingeniously, they recycled the enemy's own waste. Unexploded American bombs, artillery shells, empty C-ration cans, and discarded metal were meticulously collected and repurposed into new deadly devices. The very tools of the American war machine were turned back against it. Second, the traps were designed with a chillingly brilliant psychological goal. The primary purpose of most Viet Cong booby traps was not to kill, but to wound. A dead soldier, from a cold, tactical perspective, is a problem that is quickly resolved. He is removed from the battlefield, but a wounded soldier is a logistical and psychological catastrophe. When a man is horrifically wounded, the entire patrol grinds to a halt. His comrades must stop to provide aid. The medic is exposed. A call for a medevac helicopter must be made, revealing the unit's position. It takes multiple men to carry one wounded soldier out of the jungle. The mission is compromised. But more than that, the wounded soldier screams. His cries of agony echo through the silent jungle, a terrifying broadcast of pain that infects the morale of every other man in his platoon. He becomes a living testament to the dangers that lurk underfoot, a story that will be told back at base, spreading the fear like a virus. Wounding, the Viet Cong understood, was far more effective than killing. Finally, the traps dictated the pace of the war. They turned the American doctrine of search and destroy into a slow, agonizing crawl. A platoon could no longer move with confidence. Every step became a life-or-death calculation. The point man, the soldier at the very front of the patrol, had the most terrifying job in the entire war. His eyes were not on the tree line, looking for an ambush. They were glued to the ground, searching for the slightest sign of disturbance. A misplaced leaf, a taut vine, a patch of earth that looked too fresh. The presence of booby traps slowed American units to a snail's pace, sometimes less than 100 meters an hour. This exhaustion and hypervigilance made them far more vulnerable when the inevitable ambush did come. They were fighting a war not just against a visible enemy, but against the ground itself. Every single step was a battle. And the first lesson in this war against the ground was taught by the most primitive, yet iconic, of all Viet Cong traps, the Punji stake. The concept was brutally simple. A stake, usually fashioned from bamboo, was sharpened to a needle-like point. The bamboo was then hardened over a fire, making it strong enough to pierce the thick leather of a combat boot and the flesh and bone beneath. This alone was a fearsome weapon, but the Viet Cong added a layer of biological warfare to its design. The tips of the Punji stakes were often deliberately smeared with filth. This could be animal or human excrement, rotting carrion, or soil known to be contaminated. The goal was not just to create a puncture wound, but to ensure that it became horribly infected. A soldier impaled on a Punji stake faced not only the immediate trauma, but the near certainty of a debilitating infection, gangrene, and, if not treated quickly, a slow, agonizing death. The Punji stake was the building block for 100 different variations of hell. The most common was the simple Punji pit. A small hole just big enough for a man's foot would be dug on a well-used trail and filled with stakes. It would then be masterfully camouflaged with leaves and twigs, making it virtually invisible. The weight of a soldier would cause the covering to break, his foot plunging down onto the waiting spikes. The angle of the stakes was often designed to make extracting the foot even more damaging, the barbs tearing at flesh as the boot was pulled out. Imagine the scene. A U.S. Marine platoon deep in the A Shau Valley. The heat is a physical presence. Sweat drips from every man's brow, stinging his eyes. The point man, a 19-year-old kid from Ohio, moves with the slow, deliberate grace of a man walking through a minefield. His M16 is held at the ready, but his focus is down. He probes the ground ahead with the butt of his rifle. Every shadow is a potential hole. Every vine, a potential tripwire. The men behind him follow in his exact footsteps, their own lives dependent on his concentration. For an hour, nothing. The only sound is the buzzing of insects and the squelch of their boots in the mud. Then, a moment of lapsed concentration. A step slightly to the left of the man in front. There is no loud explosion, just a soft crackle of breaking twigs, followed by a sharp, guttural scream of pure agony. Instantly, the entire platoon hits the dirt, weapons raised, scanning the silent jungle for the source of an attack. But there is no attack. There are no muzzle flashes. There's only the sound of their friend, screaming and writhing on the ground, his foot trapped in a hole that wasn't there a second ago. The patrol halts. The mission is over. The medic rushes forward, calling for morphine and wire cutters, knowing that the next few minutes of trying to free the man will be a form of torture in itself. The jungle remains silent, watching. Every other man in that platoon feels a cold knot of fear in his stomach. The enemy didn't fire a single shot, yet he had claimed a victim. He had won. He had reminded them that he was everywhere and nowhere. He was the ground beneath their feet. But the simple Punji steak, as terrifying as it was merely the opening act in a theater of cruelty, a primitive greeting card from the ghosts of the jungle. The true depths of their ingenuity and the true nightmare for the American soldier were only just beginning to be revealed. The Punji pit was a weapon of passive aggression. It lay in wait, relying on a soldier's single misstep. But as the American presence in Vietnam grew, so too did the Viet Cong's tactical evolution. Their trap makers, often local villagers with an intimate knowledge of carpentry and the terrain, began to design more active, more complex, and far more terrifying devices. They moved from attacking a soldier's feet to attacking his entire body, and they did this by harnessing the simple, elegant power of stored kinetic energy. One of the most infamous of these was the side-closing trap. Instead of a pit, 2 plates or gratings of punji stakes were placed vertically on either side of a narrow jungle trail, hidden by the foliage. The 2 plates were connected by a tripwire stretched taut across the path. When a soldier's foot caught the wire, it released the tension, causing the 2 spiked walls to slam shut with incredible force, impaling the victim from both sides. It was a human-sized bear trap, a device of medieval cruelty brought into the age of the helicopter. Another terrifying variation was the whip trap. A long bamboo pole studded with punji stakes at one end was bent back under extreme tension, like a massive drawn bow. It was held in place by a catch which was connected to a tripwire. When the wire was tripped, the pole was released, whipping across the trail at chest or head height with enough force to kill a man instantly or inflict horrific wounds. The sheer speed of the whipping pole made it nearly impossible to react to. One moment a soldier was walking, the next a spiked club had materialized out of the jungle, a silent, deadly blur of green. These traps were often placed after a small obstacle, like a fallen log, at the exact moment a soldier was focused on his footing and not on the space just ahead. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging of all the punji-based traps was the mace. A heavy ball or log studded with spikes would be hung from a tree branch high above a trail. It was connected by a vine or wire to a tripwire below. When triggered, the spiked mace would swing down from the canopy like a monstrous pendulum. What made this trap so insidious was its placement. It was often set on a bend in the trail, so the point man who tripped the wire would be spared, but the man directly behind him, or the one after that, would be the one to take the full, devastating impact. This sowed discord and mistrust within the platoon. No one was safe, not even if you were in the middle of the formation. The threat was 3-dimensional. It came from below, from the sides, and now from above. The American response to this evolving threat was one of methodical, painstaking caution. Patrols learned to move at a glacial pace. The point man's job became even more critical. He was now armed not just with a rifle, but often with a long stick or a bayonet, which he used to probe the ground ahead, feeling for the telltale tautness of a wire. The phrase, "don't touch nothin'," became a mantra. Every vine, every branch, every seemingly innocent piece of bamboo was treated as a potential trigger. Soldiers learned to look for signs, disturbed earth, unnatural arrangements of leaves, or the glint of a thin wire in the dappled jungle light. They developed a sixth sense, a primal paranoia that was essential for survival. But the Viet Cong were masters of camouflage and deception. They were constantly adapting, making their traps more difficult to detect. Tripwires were not always at ankle height. They could be at the chest, designed to be hit by a soldier's weapon, or at the knee. They were painted with mud to blend in, or hidden underwater in rice paddies and streams. The trapmakers also used the Americans' own caution against them. They would place a single, obvious punji stake in the middle of a trail. The American patrol would spot it, and in the process of carefully disarming it or navigating around it, they would be funneled directly into a much larger, more complex trap hidden just off the path. It was a game of psychological chess, and the VC were playing on their home board. The introduction of tripwires did more than just create physical hazards, it fundamentally altered the soldier's relationship with his environment. The jungle was no longer just a difficult place to be, it was an active antagonist, a web of invisible threads waiting to be broken. This had a profound effect on the morale and mental state of the G.I.s. The constant, unrelenting tension was a form of torture. Unlike an ambush, which was a moment of intense, violent terror followed by silence, the threat of booby traps was a low-level, continuous hum of anxiety that never, ever went away. It followed a soldier on patrol, it was there when he ate his rations, and it haunted his sleep. This constant stress led to a condition known as booby trap psychosis. Soldiers became hyper-vigilant to the point of exhaustion. They would freeze at the sight of a spider's web. They would flinch at the rustle of leaves. Some became so paranoid they refused to move, their minds overwhelmed by the infinite possibilities of death hidden in the foliage around them. The psychological toll was immense, far exceeding the physical casualties the traps themselves caused. By late 1966, reports indicated that booby traps were accounting for over 10% of all American casualties, and in some heavily contested areas like the Iron Triangle, that number was significantly higher. But the number of men suffering from combat stress, from the sheer mental exhaustion of walking through a minefield day after day, was incalculable. And just when the Americans began to adapt their tactics to the threat of primitive, non-explosive traps, the Viet Cong changed the game again. They began to integrate explosives into their designs, combining their low-tech ingenuity with the high-tech power of modern ordnance. This new phase of the war against the ground would prove to be even more lethal. The Viet Cong had a near-endless supply of raw materials, thanks to the sheer volume of American bombing. Operation Rolling Thunder and other bombing campaigns dropped millions of tons of explosives on Vietnam, but a significant percentage of these bombs, grenades, and artillery shells, sometimes as high as 20%, were duds. They failed to detonate on impact. For the Americans, this was a minor technical failure. For the Viet Cong, it was a gift from the sky. Villagers, including women and children, were organized into collection teams. They would scour the countryside for unexploded ordnance, UXO. This was incredibly dangerous work. A slight jostle could cause a dormant fuse to activate. But the reward was worth the risk. A single 500-pound bomb contained enough high explosive to create dozens of smaller devices. Specialist VC teams, often with rudimentary training, would then undertake the terrifying task of disarming these bombs and harvesting the explosives, usually TNT or Composition B. With this harvested explosive, the Viet Cong created their most effective and feared device, the toe popper. The concept was simple but diabolical. A small amount of explosive, often no more than a handful, would be packed into a small container, a sea ration can, a condensed milk tin, or a simple bamboo tube. A blasting cap would be inserted, connected to a simple pressure-release firing mechanism. The entire device, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, would be buried just below the surface of a trail. When a soldier stepped on it, the pressure would arm the device. When he lifted his foot, it would detonate. The trap was not designed to kill, it was designed to blow a man's foot off. The name toe popper was a grimly ironic piece of G.I.s slang for a device that did far more than pop toes. It ended a man's career, and often his life as he knew it. More powerful were the command-detonated mines. Using the same harvested explosives, the VC would create massive explosive charges and bury them on roads known to be used by American trucks and armored personnel carriers. The mine would be connected by hundreds of meters of concealed wire to a hidden observer with a simple battery-powered detonator. The observer would wait patiently, sometimes for days, for the perfect target. Not the first truck in the convoy, but the command vehicle or the fuel tanker. With a single press of a button, he could unleash a devastating explosion that would obliterate a vehicle and terrorize an entire convoy. But the true genius of the Viet Cong was in combining their low-tech and high-tech traps. A classic example was the grenade in a can. A standard American M26 grenade would be placed inside a tin can with the safety pin removed. The can held the safety lever, the spoon, in place. The can would then be attached to a tripwire. When the wire was tripped, it would pull the grenade out of the can. The safety spoon would fly off, the fuse would ignite, and 4 to 5 seconds later, the grenade would explode, spraying shrapnel in all directions. These were often placed at waist height, designed to cause maximum damage to a tightly packed patrol. Imagine the point man, his eyes on the ground, carefully avoiding a suspected Punji pit. He successfully navigates it. A wave of relief washes over him. But as he pushes aside a large leaf to continue, his rifle barrel snags a thin, almost invisible wire. He hears a faint thunk behind him, in the middle of his formation. Someone yells, "Grenade!" The men have less than 5 seconds to react. They dive into the mud, into the thorns, anywhere, as the world erupts in a flash of light and a hailstorm of hot steel. The enemy, once again, hadn't fired a shot, but the jungle itself had thrown a grenade. The ghosts were everywhere, their presence felt not in what the soldiers saw, but in the constant, terrifying threat of what they couldn't see. The war against the ground had escalated into a war against every object, every shadow, every single inch of the Vietnamese landscape. Faced with an escalating and increasingly lethal threat from explosive booby traps, the United States military did what it did best. It turned to technology and overwhelming force. The response to the Viet Cong's low-tech ingenuity was a high-tech counteroffensive. Specialized units of combat engineers, known as tunnel rats for their work in underground complexes, also became experts in trap disposal. They were equipped with sophisticated mine detectors, probes, and explosive charges designed to neutralize devices from a safe distance. The military also developed new equipment for the average G.I. minesweeping, became a standard patrol procedure, with soldiers at the front carrying heavy, cumbersome metal detectors, sweeping them back and forth over the trail in a slow, tedious rhythm. More advanced, classified technologies were also deployed, including experimental explosive sniffers designed to detect the chemical compounds of TNT. For a time, it seemed that American technology might finally tame the jungle. But for every countermeasure the Americans developed, the Viet Cong devised a countermeasure. They quickly learned how mine detectors worked. The detectors functioned by creating an electromagnetic field and sensing disruptions caused by metal objects. So the Viet Cong began building traps with the absolute minimum of metal components. They fashioned firing pins from hardened bamboo or scraps of non-magnetic materials. They encased explosives in plastic, glass, or even hollowed-out coconuts. These low-metal mines were virtually invisible to the standard issue detectors, rendering the expensive technology useless. The American soldier was forced to rely once again on his most basic and most fallible tool, his own eyes. The VC even turned the minesweeping procedure itself into a weapon. Knowing that patrols were now moving even more slowly, bunched up behind the detector operator, they began to target the patrol as a whole. They would place a large command-detonated mine on the trail, but instead of connecting it to a simple trigger, they connected it to an observer hidden hundreds of meters away. The observer would watch as the minesweeper carefully swept the area and, finding nothing, gave the all-clear signal. The moment the bulk of the platoon moved into the kill zone, believing it to be safe, the observer would detonate the mine, causing mass casualty. This tactic was particularly insidious, as it destroyed the soldiers' faith in their own technology and procedures. Nothing was safe. Nowhere was safe. The psychological impact of this constant evolving threat cannot be overstated. The booby traps created an atmosphere of pure paranoia. It turned comrade against comrade. A soldier who was careless and tripped a wire that wounded his friends would be ostracized and racked with guilt. It created a deep-seated resentment and hatred not just for the visible enemy, but for the entire landscape and its civilian population. Who was setting these traps? Was it the farmer smiling at them from his rice paddy? The old woman selling them sodas? The children who ran alongside their jeeps? The traps blurred the line between civilian and combatant, turning the entire country into a potential enemy. This erosion of trust was a key objective of the Viet Cong strategy, and it was devastatingly effective. Veterans of the war would later speak of the 1,000-yard stare of the point man after weeks in the boonies. An empty, disconnected look born from the unbearable strain of knowing that a single moment of inattention could mean a horrific death for himself or his friends. The fear was constant, but the nature of the fear changed. A firefight was terrifying, but it was a shared experience, a moment of violent, adrenaline-fueled camaraderie. The fear of booby traps was a deeply personal, isolating, and lonely terror. It was just you and the ground. The ingenuity of the Viet Cong trapmakers seemed limitless. They devised traps for river crossings using submerged spikes and tripwired explosives. They created cartridge traps, where a single rifle bullet was placed inside a piece of bamboo and set to fire when stepped on. They even weaponized the local fauna, placing venomous snakes like the bamboo viper inside backpacks or caches of documents, knowing that an inquisitive GI might open them. These snakes were nicknamed two-steppers, a grim piece of slang referring to the fact that after being bitten, you could only take 2 more steps before collapsing. The ultimate legacy of the Viet Cong's booby traps was not measured in the number of casualties they inflicted, though that number was significant, with estimates attributing over 60,000 American casualties to them throughout the war. The true success of the strategy was in how it fundamentally altered the balance of power. The traps allowed a technologically primitive force to dictate the terms of engagement to a military superpower. They slowed the American war machine to a crawl, turning its aggressive search-and-destroy doctrine into a hesitant defensive shuffle. They inflicted a steady, bleeding toll of casualties that, while perhaps not militarily decisive on any given day, contributed to the growing sense of a pointless, unwinnable war back home. Most importantly, they won the war for the one piece of territory that mattered most: the mind of the American soldier. They created an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere, a constant, invisible presence that could not be defeated by bombs or bullets. They turned the jungle, the very ground of Vietnam, into the most effective soldier in the Viet Cong army. The American GI arrived in Vietnam trained to fight a war of technology and firepower. He soon found himself in a primal struggle for survival, fighting against an enemy that used sharpened sticks and recycled trash with tactical genius. The story of the bamboo traps of the Viet Cong is a brutal lesson in asymmetric warfare. It is a testament to the idea that in war, the will to resist can be more powerful than the might to destroy. The soldiers who survived the jungles of Vietnam returned home with scars, both visible and invisible. And for many, the deepest scars were left by the silent, patient, and ever-present ghosts who had turned the very ground beneath their feet into the front line of a war against the mind. If you value the rescue of this story, please like and subscribe to the channel.